Hey everyone, welcome to the November 7th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are looking back at Breeders' Cup weekend. Like always, it was a whirlwind, a ton of stories, a ton of top performances, a lot of favorites coming in, but I don't think that deterred from the excitement of both days, and we're going to take a look back at all of it on this podcast, beginning by discussing all 9 Breeders' Cup races from Saturday. We'll kind of go a little bit in reverse chronological order, maybe mixing a few things up. Between our discussion of Saturday and Friday, Craig and I will have a brief discussion of our early opinions on some Eclipse Awards, primarily the Horse of the Year award, which I think is going to be hotly debated this year. Then we'll discuss those 2-year-old performances from Friday, all 5 of them. We're just going to stick to the Breeders' Cup races on this podcast. I think that's going to provide us with more than enough to discuss for the likely hour duration of this episode. Craig, you experienced it in person, so just give me some quick hits from your trip out west.
I had a great time. Me and my wife Elsie were there both days. We actually got to California on Wednesday. I actually got to have lunch with my figure maker assistant. That was always fun. Went out to the ocean, but the racing was great after that. Both days. The weather was perfect. Couldn't ask for anything better. Met so many people who listened to our podcast. There was even a few I didn't get to meet who I really wanted to, but there's only so much time in the day. And yeah, people really like our show. Got a lot of great feedback on that, and it was really nice to hear. But first and foremost, the racing was just fabulous.
Yeah, always love hearing that. Great seeing fans out at the racetrack, especially these days when maybe we don't make it out to the track as much as we had in the past. So that's always nice to connect with people. And great to hear you had a nice time out there, Craig. And as you said, the racing was really top notch on Saturday. And yes, we did have a lot of favorites winning, but typically when that's the case, it means you're seeing a lot of high-level performances because the horses that are expected to show up are the horses that show up on the day. And at the end of the day, you do want to see these races actually live up to the hype, and I think a lot of them did. Let's begin with not the last Breeders' Cup race on Saturday, but the one that I think everyone regards as the future Breeders' Cup race, the classic race 9 on that Saturday card. And Craig, watching this race in real time, White Abarrio just looked like he was going to win all the way around the track. He was sitting in the perfect spot, and maybe he didn't quite get the 1.25 miles, but I don't think it mattered because he had the race won at the 8th pole.
He did. It was a good performance. We hadn't seen him since early August, and I was a little skeptical he'd be able to reproduce what we saw from him in the Whitney, but he did it with no problem. Didn't quite run the same speed figure. He ran a 132 in the Whitney, a 129 in the Classic. Maybe a little of that's because of the distance, but there was nobody really coming. I mean, Derma Sotogake made a nice run to get second, but never really looked like he was going to threaten the winner. So good, strong performance from Wade Barrio. I guess he's going to stay in training from what I read last year, though we're probably unlikely to see him in the States for quite some time.
Yeah, and we had talked about this a little bit on our preview show last week when I kind of had my preliminary opinions about the Breeders' Cup, and I sort of solidified those throughout the week. I was writing this in the betting strategies that I did with Brad Free, just kind of questioning the notion that the 3-year-olds were going to dominate this race, but we had kind of decided early on this season how strong the 3-year-olds appeared, but we had some key defections leading up to the race, and I know you were saying this early last week. When you sat down to handicap it, the older horses looked pretty solid, and White Abarrio, I mean, just seemed like a really logical horse coming into this race. Got the job done running a solid 129 TimeformUS speed figure. Like you said, it's not going to be in the upper echelon of classic winning performances, but it was decent. And kind of shockingly, the top 3-year-old finisher in this classic was the Japanese horse, Derma Sotogake, coming off the long layoff. I had mentioned early last week, Craig, that we probably shouldn't forget that this horse had run what everybody who makes speed figure makers thought was a very fast number early on the season, and we were kind of waiting for some validation of it for that UAE Derby performance. Didn't get it in the Kentucky Derby, but off the long layoff, I think we got some confirmation that this horse might be pretty good if he can ever put a full campaign together.
Yeah, hopefully they can keep him sound. As a speed figure guy, I was kind of happy that the speed figure I had talked about was kind of proven. He didn't show it in the Derby. He was a horse who his time form rating was Pretty light from that UAE Derby, even though it was really a faster race than what we saw in the Dubai World Cup. So I was glad to see him produce, and who knows when we'll see him here again, but he certainly got some talent. I don't think it's a great sign that the two horses that ran 1-2 in the Classic were both coming off of pretty long layoffs. It's hard enough to get some of these horses to the races as it is from some of these barns, and I just hope that doesn't exacerbate the trend.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think we're seeing a lot more of that these days. I think with one of them, it was the plan with Derma Sotogake. I don't think they were hoping to go into the race off the long layoff, and he just sort of ran this well in spite of it because he's a really good horse. So I'll be interested to see what they do with him. It does sound like Derma Sotogake is staying in training, and hopefully we'll see him cross the Pacific to make some more trips to the U.S. in next year, or perhaps in the Breeders' Cup again, because he's a really talented horse. Proxy, who I did end up landing on in this race, was just the typical frustrating watch that Proxy normally is. Looked like he was spinning his wheels going backwards on the far turn, and suddenly when they turned to the stretch and he sees that straightaway ahead of him, he started running like a freight train at the end, but the race was already over at that point.
Yeah, that was kind of typical Proxy. He does seem to enjoy the mile and a quarter. It just takes him a little bit longer to get going than you would like to see. Kind of like he was just pedaling back there. But good effort from him to stay third. Haven't heard what the plans are from him. I hope a horse like him sticks around because he runs a lot. He seems to be solid, so I hope he stays. I did want to mention Arabian Night. I thought he ran a good race. He actually got a speed figure just as good as Derma Sotogake from TimeformUS because the pace was pretty darn quick in the Classic. He was pressed at one point during the race by Saudi Crown, shook him off, and actually held on pretty good for a while to finish. I think he was only beaten a little over 2 lengths. So good effort from him. Not a whole lot in behind. Ushba Tesoro, the Japanese horse, just kind of ran okay, never really looked like a threat, and I think you could probably say that for everybody else in the field.
Yeah, I thought Arabian Night ran pretty well. The pace of this race was pretty quick through the early stages, especially when you consider that 154 pace figure for the opening half mile. Arabian Night had a right to get tired after that, so he ran well, but I don't think he did enough to really put himself at the top of the list for 3-year-old Eclipse Award. That feels like the one that wasn't really altered by this race. It's going to be Arcangelo, as it probably should be, based on his Belmont and Travers victories. Nobody else can really match those accomplishments. Let's move on to the Breeders' Cup Turf, the race that was run right before the Classic. And this is one, Craig, where it really felt, well, I'll say one of many, I think, on the Friday and Saturday cards at Santa Anita, where it felt like a winning ride really made the difference. And that was the case with Ryan Moore on August Rodin, who saved all the ground, took advantage of another jockey's mistake at the quarter pole coming through along the inside, and was able to beat a couple of horses that maybe didn't run any worse than he did, but just did not get trips nearly as good as his.
Yeah, that one was painful for me. I was in the Sherry R camp. It turned out okay as I had some tries, but obviously would have been a lot better had he been able to run first or second. Not sure why the jockey left the rail. He seemed to be getting a perfect trip, but that's why Ryan Moore is one of the best, if not the best rider in the world. He was there ready to take advantage, and he did so. And it's a race where, depending on trips, any of the top three, I think, could have won. Auguste Rodin ran a 127 TimeformUS speed figure, so good solid race. Not among the better we've seen. We've seen races in the 130s, but he verified that form we saw overseas, and not a big surprise. And I don't want to take anything away from Up to the Mark. I was very impressed by him. First time going a mile and a half, he proved that was no surprise, and hard to doubt or Todd Pletcher in these situations. If he ran him at a mile and a half, you had to think he had a pretty good idea he could get it. I think it's pretty obvious he's going to win the Turf Eclipse, but he's just a really good horse. Unfortunately, he's been retired as well.
Yeah, I was really impressed by Up to the Mark's effort. He arguably ran the best race of anybody when you consider that he was legitimately 3 wide around every turn of this race. That's a tough thing to do going a mile and a half, and he was still fighting back at the end. As you said, Shahryar, sort of his rider Christian Demoro, made that critical error at the top of the stretch, not staying inside, trying to angle off the rail. It would have been nice for him if it worked out. It didn't. Just got in a little bit of traffic at that point. August Rodin and Ryan Moore, they took that spot, and Shahryar had to settle for third. So if he had gotten through, he would have been a very lucky winner. Up to the mark, it's a little bit of a shame that he's going off to the breeding shed, because it feels like we missed seeing him in a few races this summer. He sort of just got back to his best, and now he's being whisked away from us. But with the pedigree that he has, being by not this time, I think he's one of those few turf horses that might actually develop some interest among breeders at studs. So we'll see how that goes for him. But I thought it was a really good addition of the Breeders' Cup turf. Let's move on to the distaff, the race run right before the turf, and this one really produced an exciting finish, Craig, is the pace that we thought would develop did develop. I think the only surprising part of it was that while it might have taken its toll on those horses contesting it, they were still able to hold on, and I think that just speaks to the fact that Idiomatic and Randomized were clearly the two best horses in this race.
They were, and I think the race was kind of won at the beginning when Florent Giroux kind of let Randomize go from the outside. Immediately steered his horse right outside of that one, and they were only separated by a half length at the end. And I wonder if that isn't what made the difference, getting that preferred outside position in what was basically a two-horse battle all the way around the track. And like you said, well, a couple of the fractions are coded in red. The early pace figures were in the upper 130s. So it's not like they were walking on the front end. They were just clearly the best two horses. I guess you could argue there were some trips in behind, but those horses should have been closing faster given the way the race developed.
Yeah, I saw some griping at the end about Clairiere getting into some traffic in the late stages. And she didn't have the clearest path at the very end of this race, but she had gotten a fantastic trip and ride prior to that, closing into that fast pace, saving all the ground. If she had gotten the split at the eighth pole, maybe she would have gotten up, but she would have gotten up as an extremely lucky winner of this race. Idiomatic ran so much better than her going after that pace. I mean, she really took it to Randomized around the far turn as they opened up a bit of a gap on the rest of the field, and the fact that they were still able to battle on to finish first and second in this race, I think just speaks to how well they ran. And you have to admire that Idiomatic is still competing at this high level after the campaign that she's had, not just running 9 times, but winning 8 races in her 2023 campaign. That's unusual for a horse at this level. And when you look in Equibase at the national leaders, not in terms of earnings, but in terms of wins, her 8 wins on the season tie her for second as the horse at any level in this country with the most wins. There's one with 10 and then a bunch with 8, and she's tied for second on that list. Just something that you rarely see with a horse that's winning a Breeders' Cup race.
Yeah, it was impressive. I haven't mentioned both her and the runner-up got 123 TimeformUS speed figures, and I think that matched her career best going back to earlier in the year. But she's just been a model of consistency, always running right around that 120, low 120s mark, and does it showing good early speed. But we've seen her win when she had a tough start from off the pace. We've seen her press the pace, seen her go to wire. So I mean, she's just a joy to watch race.
As for Randomized, I think that's going to be an interesting Eclipse Award to discuss, whether she did enough to steal it away from Pretty Mischievous. It's kind of a victory would have definitely done it. Her second place finish and a valiant one in defeat, I think, makes it interesting. I, at this stage, would kind of be leaning towards saying, yeah, Randomized did enough, because when you look back at some of Pretty Mischievous's accomplishments, they don't exactly hold up to scrutiny, especially considering the fact that she was going to lose the test to another horse, and some of her Acorn was just winning by a whisker over a horse that's been inconsequential this season. And Randomized's Breeders' Cup distaff, I think, can speak pretty loudly when you compare it to some of those accomplishments. So at this stage, I'm kind of leaning Randomized, but we'll, I'm sure, talk in more detail about the Eclipse Awards later.
Yeah, I haven't given it too much thought. I mean, I think there's a lot of divisions. We're going to talk about it, I'm sure, but just plenty. Normally, most of the divisions are kind of slam dunks, but doesn't appear that way this year, and this is certainly one of them.
Yeah, I love an Eclipse Award debate, and as you said, I think we've got a few of those this year. The Mile, which was run right before the Distaff, produced yet another really exciting finish as two Godolphin horses hit the wire together. Boy, it looked like Maj had this race won with just yards to go, but Master of the Seas came flying figured out of nowhere to win this race. Just a really impressive late run from him under William Buick. Wouldn't even necessarily say this was some miracle ride or anything like that. Master of the Seas just produced the kind of kick that was necessary to get him up at the wire. Really thrilling result to this race.
It was. I gotta check this chart. Go watch the replay. I assume it's right. They have Master of the Seas 11th with a furlong to go, 5 3/4 lengths behind, which seems almost impossible. But I know it was pretty eye-catching watching it live, so it could very well be right. But that just seems crazy. I can't remember seeing a chart like that. Master of the Seas gets a 127 TimeformUS speed figure, and Maj actually gets a couple points higher, pressing what was a pretty quick pace with pace figures in the 140s. So good, strong effort from the top two. I give a shout out to the couple American horses that were third and fourth. I thought they ran fine, and Casa Creed and Gina Romanica. They were just beaten by horses that were a little bit better on the day.
Yeah, Master of the Seas produced quite a late kick to get up in this race. I actually just pulled up the GMAX chart to compare it to what's in the official chart from Equibase, and the GMAX tracking caught him in 10th with a furlong to go, and they've got him coming home his last furlong in 10.88 seconds. So just a remarkable late split for Master of the Seas to get up in this race, and he really did have to do some running to get past Maj, who was not stopping at the end. She ran really well. She was in attendance to what was an honest pace, and just kind of got run down by a horse who maybe ran a little bit better than her. Like you said, good showings from Casa Creed, who just always shows up and being the top American finisher in this race. Songline, she went off, I think, as the slight favorite over Master of the Seas in the end. Was a little wide around the turns, maybe never in a great position, but she, at the end of the day, was a little bit disappointing. It was a really exciting Breeders' Cup Mile.
It was. It always is one of the most exciting races, and it will continue to be because it's one that attracts horses from just all over the world. And with Japan sending more and more horses, I doubt that's going to change anytime soon.
Let's move on to the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf as we'll finish up some of the turf racing from this Saturday card. And yet another really exciting finish here, Craig. And not only an exciting finish, but two absolutely masterful rides put in by Frankie Dettori and Ryan Moore. Ryan Moore just put on a clinic this weekend and didn't come out on the winning end here, but I mean, he gave his mount Warm Heart every chance to win this race. Dettori did the right thing within Spiral, saved ground around the turns, was able to get her into the clear when he needed to, and she just produced the superior kick to get up in the end.
She did, and as we suspected, 1.25 miles was well within her scope. The trainer, John Gosden, obviously thought she could get it, and she did, no problem at all. And not only did she get it, she ran the fastest TimeformUS speed figure on the weekend, getting a 130, just a point above Warm Heart, and a 129. So just a really strong addition to the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf.
Yeah, those two European contenders did run the two best races here. Nice showing from Moira, who we can't really claim as a U.S. horse being based in Canada, but a nice North American representative, finishing third in here. One of the better Japanese showings was that long shot, Win Marilyn, who came flying at the end and just missed third. I wish she would have really helped me if she had gotten up for third in this race, but that's another story. But they were sort of just fringe players in this race. The two that finished in the photo for the win in Spiral and Warm Heart were just a cut above the rest. We should probably mention in Italian, Craig, who faded to finish fifth. Like we thought, 1.25 miles, just a little bit beyond her scope, and it'll be interesting to see how the Eclipse Award goes in this division. It's pretty clearly between her and Inspiral, and I think it just comes down to voter preference, whether or not you can take a horse that only has one start in the U.S.
Yeah, I don't think there was really a great race for her this year. I'm not sure she would have fared much better in the mile, but she has been quite the horse. I haven't heard what the plans are for her. I've seen some people say that maybe she's tailing off because she's not winning this year, but I think that was her sixth or seventh time in a row running a 125 plus TimeformUS speed figure. So if she does come back, I'm not writing her off yet. I just think she needs to go a little bit shorter. But if she doesn't come back, she doesn't know anybody anything. She's had one heck of a career.
Between those two races that we just discussed, they ran the filly and mare sprint, and this one was just a tour de force by the heavy favorite winner, Goodnight Olive, a deserving repeat champion in this division, especially with Echo Zulu being on the sidelines and probably not going to compete in this race anyway. Goodnight Olive just looked like she had this field at her mercy, and that's how it played out on the racetrack.
It did. It was she looked best on paper by quite a bit, and as you said, that's how it played out. She ran a 123 time form US speed figure. Um, this will be an interesting Eclipse discussion because she won the race, but she was handled pretty easily by Echo Zulu. But in the end, I think she's going to wind up winning it, and probably deservedly so.
Echo Zulu just didn't do enough this season. I mean, I know she ran the best races, and I don't think anybody would argue that she wasn't the best horse in this division. But Eclipse Awards are about the campaign, and I think Goodnight Olive put together the campaign. So kind of feel, at least from this photo's perspective, like you've got to give it to her. And she was just really impressive. There was a moment at the top of the stretch that I know got some people talking about her cutting off another horse a little bit. I believe that was Society. I'll just, in fairness, Goodnight Olive just does that. I wouldn't say that that was all IRAD. If you watch all of her races, she just has that tendency to lug in at that point of the stretch. We've seen her do it time and again this year. I think that was one of the things that got her in trouble in that Derby City distaff earlier in the year when she started lugging in and he couldn't get her out of traffic. So I thought that was a little unfair that some people were criticizing IRAD for that, though I think he did get a suspension for that.
He did his second one in brief time. He's about to serve one, I think, on the Naira circuit as well. Um, I'd have to go back and watch it again. Watching live, it looked bad, but I'll take your word for it that it's probably the horse. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on it because at the end, it really didn't matter as far as the race went.
No. Let's go back to the first Breeders' Cup race that they ran on Saturday. That was the Dirt Mile, and got the day started off with a story that I know has moved a lot of people in racing. A story that racing has really embraced during Cody's Wish's career, and Cody's Wish was able to deliver with a performance, Craig, that was essentially a carbon copy of his Dirt Mile last year, right down to the heart-stopping finish.
Yeah, it was something. This was the one race I actually watched out on the track, right on the apron instead of from my seat. And I was pretty sure he got up. I still have yet to watch the replay. I guess there was an inquiry and an objection. You knew this horse was never coming down, barring just something pretty serious. And I don't think that was the case. And it was good to see Cody's Wish back in form. We were a little bit shaky on that after his last race when he came back in the Vosburg, a race that didn't feature any pace. So maybe it kind of muted his run that day. But he was back on Saturday, got a 127 time form US speed figure, and certainly is one of the ones you have to consider for Horse of the Year.
Yeah, he got the job done here. The Dirt Mile, I think we talked about it last week. It came up with sort of a disappointing field outside of Cody's Wish. He had to work a little harder for the victory than I think most people expected, though I've got to say, Craig, I don't know where National Treasure got this speed from. I don't know why they didn't show it in the Travers or the Awesome Again. They decided that this horse was better rating, but I mean, they had him show speed here, and it turns out he's just a horse that's a lot better when he's on the engine. So I don't know when Baffert started rating horses, but I think he got back to basics with National Treasure, and he put in one of the better showings from a Southern California horse in the entire Breeders' Cup, and one of the better showings from a 3-year-old.
Yeah, he actually got a point higher speed figure because of the pace than Cody's Wish. I mean, there wasn't a lot of pace. It's one of those weird algorithm things where the pace was actually speeding up at the end, but Cody's switch went so slow in the beginning, he got penalized a little. But he made that big middle move that it looked like he was going to run right by, and National Treasure just dug in and was game all the way to the wire. So I look forward. Hopefully, he's coming back next year. I assume National Treasure would be coming back. He doesn't, I guess he won the Preakness, but it just doesn't seem like he has a resume to go to stud, but who knows anymore. But he would be an exciting horse to come back, assuming they keep with those front running tactics, because it certainly works for him.
Yeah, and looking at the TimeformUS pace figure line for this dirt mile, Cody's Wish did run better than I think I originally thought. The fractions can be really tough to read, the raw fractions, that is, going this 1 mile distance at Santa Anita. We've talked about how there's a long run up for this race, and it sort of artificially makes the fractions seem faster than they are. The third quarter of this race went pretty fast, and that's when Cody's Wish made his move, and you can sort of see it in his pace figure line going from a 107 up to a 122 up to a 127. He really made a big move at about the half to 3/4 pole in this race, and I think that's why he maybe was flattening out a little bit at the end, but he nevertheless was able to get the job done. He's been a horse that knows how to win races, and sort of a fairy tale ending for the horse. We did get that news yesterday about the unfortunate passing of his namesake, Cody Dorman. I know that was a story that kind of shook a lot of people. It just seemed like the timing of which was a thing that you would typically see in a Hollywood script with the sad ending to a movie, but it's real life, and just sort of an unfortunate and crazy ending to that story.
Yeah, that was really sad to see. I mean, it just didn't expect it, and kind of heartbreaking. But you'd like to think at least he had that great memory of Cody's Wish winning this race in a thrilling fashion.
And let's stick with the Bill Mott theme as we'll talk about the Breeders' Cup Sprint, which was run as the last Breeders' Cup race of the day on Saturday. So Bill Mott with these bookend winners on the Saturday card. And Elite Power, kind of like Cody's Wish, Craig, he just keeps showing up. I mean, he had that blip at Saratoga over the summer when the pace was just totally against him in the forego, but other than that, Elite Power has been rock solid, and I think when you go back through sprint divisions over the past decade or so, Craig, Elite Power has got to be considered one of the most accomplished sprinters from a consistency standpoint, or just showing up in the big races that we've had in years.
Yeah, he's really good. I mean, I remember tweeting a while back, I forget which race, that I was done trying to beat this horse. And of course, I think he lost his very next race, but he has rebounded very nicely, taking the Breeders' Cup Sprint with a 122 TimeformUS speed figure. And he's one that never really ran flashy speed figures, but his final time figure was a 125. And for whatever reason, he just kind of came along at a time when there isn't a lot of speed in these sprints. He's been in races with blue fractions over and over again, and he's just a horse who probably hasn't been given a chance to run his best, but he's really good, and I'm not going to hold the speed figures against him. And I would imagine he's a horse, definitely an outsider being a sprinter, but he's probably one of 4 or 5 horses that's going to get votes for Horse of the Year, and deservedly so.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the push I saw for him on Saturday night, I did put out a poll about Horse of the Year, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. I didn't really consider him as a candidate, and I feel like sometimes people get a little biased by the last thing that they just saw, and obviously Elite Power decisively winning the Breeders' Cup Sprint ended the Breeders' Cup card on Saturday. But I mean, at the end of the day, he's got 2 Grade 1 victories this season, going 6 furlongs. That would be an unprecedentedly light campaign for a Horse of the Year. So I get him being maybe on the fringe of the conversation. It's hard for me to see him actually being a horse to win that award. But I mean, he's clearly the champion sprinter, and it's really cool that a horse was able to win the Breeders' Cup Sprint 2 years in a row, just given how unsettled this division has been and how we've seen horses that seem like they're flashes in the pan, I should say, run these big speed figures, then go to the sidelines. There's been no consistency in the sprint division, and Elite Power actually gives us that. So nice to see him win this race once again for Bill Mott, who had a really big Breeders' Cup weekend. Unfortunately, Gunite is just sort of the bridesmaid in this situation. He did get the better of Elite Power that one time in the Forgo when everything went his way, but just when he gets any sort of pace to close into, Gunite is just not able to beat Elite Power, his main nemesis.
Yeah, and it feels like you briefly mentioned it earlier with National Treasure. The real disappointments in this race, I would say, had to be the California, Southern California sprinters, and it was kind of the theme of the whole Breeders' Cup, where they just really didn't show up and offer anything, be it dirt or turf. Muth ran fine. We'll get to him later. National Treasure ran okay, but it was pretty eye-catching how dominant all the horses were shipping in between the East Coast and Europe. The home field advantage just didn't seem to be any kind of advantage.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it later. We're in a race where that difference was really stark, but I think this was a race where a lot of people were expecting it to be the best chance for some of the West Coast-based horses, just given what we had seen some strength in a few of the preps over the summer at Del Mar and that Samson Sprint Championship, but it just didn't translate. And the East Coast horses, despite the Breeders' Cup being contested out west, absolutely dominated. Hopefully one day there's another Breeders' Cup on the East Coast. I mean, that's not in Kentucky. We'll see how that all plays out with the construction project at Belmont Park. But I mean, if the West Coast horses can't win when the Breeders' Cup is based out west, I think that it says a lot about some of the quality of competition out there.
Oh, and one more thing I wanted to mention about this race. The day was really consistent on Santa Anita, on the dirt surface at Santa Anita until this race. This is a race that I broke out from all the others. It gets the B notation, and it's one where it looks really fast on paper, but if I use the same variant as the other races, it's a race where we would have had three historically fast sprinters, even four counting Speedboat Beach, and it just seems to me like something happened in between while they were running turf races on either side. I was there. I didn't really pay attention to track maintenance, but it simply was a race that you had to break out. I originally actually had this race a little slower, but my assistant sent his figures in for the day, and I kind of split the difference between where we went. Which is something I normally wouldn't do. I would pick one or the other, but since it was a breakout race, I could see either side of it. So the speed figure on this one maybe has some leeway in it on either side, but just a race that, for whatever reason, the track was totally different than the rest of the day.
Yeah, and I saw some figure makers. I mean, people obviously will take note of the Beyer speed figure, which had this as the highest figure awarded to any Breeders' Cup race of the 2 days. I think they gave it a 111 Beyer. You know, I guess if you just want to play it straight, and that's certainly a lot easier for the fans and handicappers to understand, and I think more people were questioning your number than Beyer, just looking at the final times, but I kind of get it, Craig. I mean, it's been a division that we've been talking about for a while. It just hasn't really had those standout speed figures, and the horses that have run them have since gone to the sidelines. It's also a bit of a problem for me that you consider that the two numbers that you can sort of use to back up that fig, if you were going to give it a high fig, for Gunite or for Elite Power, they've both got the P notation in TimeformUS. They're numbers that you sort of had to project up to be higher based on slower paces. So it just feel a little bit iffy to award this race the high speed figure that it just kind of merits on the surface of things. So I really do understand the call that you made. It's one of those where you can debate it till the end of the time. What's the right speed figure for this race until horses run back, and we might not see many of them run back. But it's one where I really do see both sides of the equation.
Yeah, and I do think the Beyer guys broke it out some, just not quite as much as I did. And at the end of the day, we just looked at horses like Nakatomi and Speedboat Beach, and it was hard to see them suddenly running 10 and 15-point career bests when they were beaten pretty easily.
Before we move on to Saturday, to Friday, I should say, one more race to talk about. That was the Turf Sprint, which was run right in between the Classic and the Sprint. And This was another exciting finish, Craig. We had a lot of these on Saturday. No balls, just barely able to hold on over a hard charging big invasion at the very end. And on a day where rides really made the difference, I think you could say the same thing about Gerardo Corrales, who allowed this horse to drop farther off the pace than we're accustomed to seeing him, and still No Balls was able to come on through. I think something we know about this horse is that he's really gritty, he's very game, a hard trier, and he was able to adapt his running style to come from just off the pace to get the job done over the hard-charging Big Invasion, who also got a nice ride from Joel Rosario.
Yeah, this was one of the more painful races for me with Big Invasion losing. I would maybe argue the nice ride a little bit, just because I think he gave up too much position when he had established good early position. But it maybe it's nitpicking, because at the end of the day, he got a clear run and saved all the ground and just wasn't good enough. I don't think there's any debate that No Balls was the best horse in here, because he had a tougher trip than Big Invasion. He got a 125 TimeformUS speed figure, and good strong effort from him. He's obviously better than I thought he was. He had run some speed figures in the past, but usually where things seem to go his way, but not so much the case here. And he was able to adapt and overcome and get the job done. So hats off to him. Really strong race.
I mean, I did see some criticism online of Joel Rosario. To me, I don't get it at all. I thought he rode this horse perfectly on Big Invasion. I mean, if you, as somebody who, I mean, if you bet him, I don't understand how you could have been expecting to get a better ride than he got. I mean, he saved all the ground, got through seemingly with enough time, and just couldn't quite get there at the end. It's just the trip that I envisioned him getting if everything worked out, and it felt like everything worked out for him. It's just, I think it's just really hard for a horse to close like he does going 5 furlongs. I think that's what we kind of learned in these 5 furlong races at Santa Anita, is that you need to have some positional speed, and I think No Balls kind of walked that fine line just perfectly by taking back just enough to take advantage of the fast pace, but also getting into position to actually win the race. And it's really hard to come from that far back in the pack, and that's just the horse Big Invasion is. He comes from off the pace. It would have been surprising if he was ahead of No Balls in the early stages. He couldn't quite get up in this race. Aesop's Fables, another horse who closed from towards the back to get up for third. He actually might have run the best race of the closers, because he had to cover more ground than they did. But it was a race that sort of fell apart in the late stages. Living the Dream, a horse that I know a lot of people liked in this race, showed his customary speed, just couldn't quite hold on even going the 5 furlongs. And I think at the end of the day, he just wasn't quite good enough.
Yeah, I just didn't like how he finished up in Lexington, and I mentioned that even though the shorter distance was coming, he just looked like a horse who probably would pack it in with some pressure. So I was right about him on that case, at least. As for the rest, it's just a good race. My only real comment on this race is we shouldn't run it at 5 furlongs when you can run it longer. And Santa Anita can run 6, they can run 6.5. I know there's some, I guess, concerns with the hill, but they run down the hill, so I don't really get it. It's hard for me to consider 5 furlongs as a true test. Even though this race fell apart, it's not like it was dominated by speed. It just seems, I don't know, I just don't like the 5 furlong Breeders' Cup Turf sprints.
Yeah, to me as well, it's very strange. I mean, it seems like they chose the one turf sprint configuration at Santa Anita where there is no dirt crossing. But I mean, if I thought the problem going down the hill was that the dirt crossing was at the end of the downhill portion, and there was concern about horses crossing the dirt when they're going such a speed. I mean, they've got the flat 5.5 and the flat 6 and 6.5 configurations now. I just don't understand why they wouldn't have taken advantage of those. They seem like much fairer races, but they did not. They ran it at 5, and I think you really see a race where trip is extremely important. Let's move on. Well, before we move on to Friday, Craig, as I promised at the start, preliminary impressions about how this Horse of the Year debate might transpire over the next couple of months. I think that predictably is a lot of support for Cody's Wish after winning the dirt mile and the season that he's had. Maybe it's not your typical horse of the year season, but I kind of understand that he's a horse that has a special place in a lot of people's hearts and emotions. And the fact that he was able to win this race in the fashion that he did on Saturday, I think that moves a lot of people, that maybe he's a horse of the year, almost in the way that Zenyatta was the horse of the year and the way that she was the horse of the people, even when she lost the Breeders' Cup Classic to Blame. So, I mean, I kind of get how that's developing, but from just tackling it from the pure results and, based on precedent, who is supposed to win these awards, I kind of find myself leaning away from Cody's Wish.
Yeah, I do as well. If I had to bet, I would bet Cody's Wish is going to win. I just think we've seen it before, like you said with Zenyatta. Um, it's early. I haven't made up my mind. I don't think he would be my pick, to be honest. I'm not sure who it would be. I think it would come down to idiomatic and up to the mark for me. No matter who you pick in this race, and I have five horses I think might get votes in Cody's Wish, White Abario, Idiomatic, Elite Power, and Up to the Mark. They all have major holes compared to other horses of the years that we've seen, but it's just the way it goes, and it's going to be pretty wide open this year that nobody has an overwhelming resume. So I'm not going to argue with anyone's picks really because it's just not cut and dry, but I'm leaning idiomatic and up to the mark. But I can see the case for literally all the others that I mentioned.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think there's a wrong answer this year. It just really comes down to what your preference is and what you really value as a voter. And for me, I mean, I value the Breeders' Cup. I value an entire campaign. And with Cody's Wish, he won a Breeders' Cup race that, first of all, I don't even know if it should exist. There's no divisional championship for the dirt mile. It's just a race that year in and year out, unless a horse is ducking the Breeders' Cup Classic of serious talent to run there, like a Liam's Map or a Nick's Go, it just comes up as a race that is not really a championship affair. And I think that was the case this year, where he beat a bunch of Grade 2 and Grade 3 horses. I mean, I know National Treasure won the Preakness, but I mean, just generally, it's not a championship race. So, I mean, Cody's Wish just sort of comes down to his Met Mile. And yeah, he ran one of the best races of the year in the Met Mile, but his surrounding campaign, it doesn't really do it for me. So I'm looking at others. I mean, White Abario's combo of the Whitney and the Breeders' Cup Classic is strong. I think that there's some resistance to White Abario for a lot of reasons. I mean, I think a lot of people don't, you just probably have something against giving Rick Dutrow Horse of the Year, just based on feelings about connections. The fact that it just sort of got so good for Rick at the very end of the season, didn't put that whole campaign together, and the fact that the Breeders' Cup Classic was watered down. We didn't get to see how he fared against Go Rocket Ride, how he fared against Arcangelo or others that didn't make the race. Even a horse like West Willpower, who seemed like one of the best dirt horses in the older handicap division earlier in the season. So I get that with White Abario there, knocks against him, and Idiomatic, I know some people just are steadfastly against voting for a fillier mare that never faced males, but she's the one that put together the campaign. 8 victories this season, a slew of stakes wins, 3 Grade 1s. I know that she had some favorable circumstances a few times, but I mean, she did beat everybody, including Nest, including Clairiere, all of the top finisher, the Secret Oath. I mean, all of the top players in this division, she just knocked them out one by one. So, I mean, I certainly get the case for her. And Up to the Mark, I mean, he would have been a slam dunk for me if he had won the Breeders' Cup Turf. I don't want to be that guy that is voting just because a horse should have won a race or had a trip in a race. I don't think that's the essence of the Eclipse Awards. It really does come down to the results on the day. But Up to the Mark still has a strong resume, running as well as he did in the Breeders' Cup Turf. I think that was the most ambitious spot to tackle for any American-based horse going for an award. And even though he didn't win, he arguably proved the most out of all of them in finishing second in that race against top international competition. So I think he's got a strong case. Like you, I'm probably leaning towards those two that I just mentioned, Idiomatic and Up to the Mark, but it's one that I might change my opinion on in the upcoming weeks, and I get why there's a lot of debate about it.
Yeah, and sadly, I guess that no one else is go. We probably won't see any of these horses run. There was a time when we would see some races afterwards that had some meaning, but it just feels unlikely this year. So I think the resumes we see now are what we're going to have when it comes time to vote. And like you, I'm probably gonna. Well, maybe not like you. I'm not sure. I'm probably going to give up to the mark a little extra credit for trying the turf instead of the mile because the horse that won the mile is a horse that he beat last time, and he beat him. I won't say easily, but I think it was pretty decisive. So for me, he ran a good second in what was probably the strongest Breeders' Cup turf I can remember in quite some time. So him, idiomatic, you made the case perfectly. We gripe a lot in this sport about horses not running like they used to, and as voters, we can say something about that and reward a horse that ran a lot. 9 times these days is a ton for a top class horse.
And as you say, I think this is the way that the divisions are going to stand through the end of the year. I mean, the Graded Stakes Committee, the American Graded Stakes Committee, has sort of dictated the fact that the season is over with the Breeders' Cup because I think as of last year, they've set up a situation where there are no Grade 1 races after this. The Clark is no longer a Grade 1, the Cigar Mile is no longer a Grade 1, so the Breeders' Cup Classic is the last Grade 1 dirt route of the year. And you could debate whether that's right or not, but that's just the state of racing these days. Let's move on to the Friday Breeders' Cup car. I think they call it the Future Stars Friday, with these 5 juvenile races as part of the Breeders' Cup. And obviously, the most impressive performance among them was turned in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. No surprise that that was the race that delivered the top speed figure and top performance, just given how strong it appeared coming in. But there was a bit of a party crasher here in Fierceness, who upset the top 4 coming into the race, winning this in an upset. It wasn't a surprise that he possessed this kind of ability, Craig. I think it was a bit of a surprise that he showed it in this race.
Yeah, I guess I kind of learned my lesson. Maybe have a little more faith in Todd Pletcher running in this race off of that pretty dismal performance last out in the Champagne. This horse was all the buzz. He was probably the Kentucky Derby favorite after his debut when he ran that huge 116 TimeformUS speed figure. And if you put a late race through that last race in the Champagne, this one would not have been surprising at all as he just absolutely blitzed the field. I think what was surprising is how slow it was early. The pace figures were really slow to the quarter mile as he was sitting just off a general partner. But once he got rolling, I mean, it was over. And had they gone another furlong, he might have won by 15 the way the race was going. He was just absolutely demolishing this field. Ran a huge 122 TimeformUS speed figure. I'm going to have to look up to see where that rates among previous juveniles, but I would guess it's got to be in the top 5.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I mean, he just absolutely crushed this field. And like you said, he got a very good trip sitting on top of a pace that was unexpectedly moderate, probably slow. I see a 2 TimeformUS pace figures color coded in blue for this race. But I mean, good trip or not, I mean, he just ran away from this field like he wanted the distance all along. And I mean, he did have an excuse in the Champagne. We talked about it. I mean, he kind of hopped at the start, was always out of position that day, and maybe he just can't run his race when he gets that kind of trip. But I mean, his debut was dazzling. This performance was superb. So he goes into next year as a very intriguing 3-year-old prospect. The way that he was able to demolish this field. Some others in behind him, some had excuses, some didn't. I think with Muth, he just wasn't good enough. He basically ran back to his American Pharoah score, finishing second in this race. It was just good enough for second best. As for the other 2 big horses from the East Coast. Timberlake, you could see that it was over right from the start. I mean, he didn't settle, even without the blinkers. I mean, he still got 2 rank, and I think that's a big problem for him moving forward, just not being able to relax when he has to rate in these races, because he's going to have to rate in the future, and he needs to be able to switch off in the early stages. Locked is the one that I think you could make a bit of an excuse for, Craig, because the pace just did not set up for him.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I what I found interesting is the 2 through 6 finishers in this race all match their speed figure from their big prep races, or even beat it by a point or two. So it's not like they didn't show up and run as good as they could. It was just fierceness was that good. And yeah, of the others in here, I would agree. Locked is probably the one that you would want going forward. Not saying over fierceness, but over the rest of them, just because the others are more horses that like to be up a little closer to the pace. And it seems like he is the one who had things go against him. I guess we should mention Prince of Monaco. I'm not really sure what to make of him. I kind of had the feeling coming in that he was more of a sprinter. I think you did too, if memory serves, but I don't really think we learned a whole lot in this race.
Yeah, I mean, he was just, I mean, he was rated from the beginning, was just never really looked like he was going to be the winner of this race, and ran okay to be fifth, but I think we still have to learn about what he wants to do, and maybe we'll get a better read on him next year. I do get the sense that moving into the Derby Trail for the 3-year-olds, Locked is going to be a horse that generates a lot of buzz, because that was a sneaky good performance. And he was off the bridle early, didn't seem comfortable trying to close through on the inside. And once Jose Ortiz switched him into the clear, he was really motoring at the end of this race, but obviously was doing so after his fierceness had already settled it. But I mean, he does feel like one of the horses, if not the only horse among these, that is really going to appreciate some extended distances next year. So I think he's one that a lot of people will be getting excited about, and probably justifiably so. Let's move on to the other dirt race on this Friday card of the Breeders' Cup, the Juvenile Fillies. And just FYI, able to keep her undefeated record intact, Craig. And we've kind of been speaking about it as a theme, how well the East Coast horses did at this Breeders' Cup. And it was most staggering in this race. I mean, you look through the order of finish, and the top 6 across the wire all raced at Saratoga, if not based in New York. They were in New York for the Saratoga meet. We had kind of talked about at Saratoga how maybe a lot went wrong during the summer meet there, but something that didn't go wrong was the 2-year-old racing. It was exceptionally strong this past summer, and we saw it here. The West Coast horses, or those that were not on the East Coast, they finished 7th through 12th in this race. I can't remember such a stark difference between where horses are based and their performances in the Breeders' Cup.
No, and I guess Tamara didn't really run well. She set the pace. It never really looked good. Once she turned from home, you knew it was over. But she did come out of the race with an injury, is going to be given some time off. So I guess we have to give her a pass for this one. But really, nobody else at all showed up outside those horses that we saw at Saratoga. And not the strongest speed figure, especially when compared to the juvenile. Just FYI, only ran a 104. Did so with a pace that was pretty solid. So quite the chasm between the Colts and the Phillies in the 2-year-old division.
I feel like we see this a lot lately, Craig, where the fillies just come up so much slower than the males. We definitely saw it last year, and I can think of a few other examples in recent times. I mean, it's just something we're supposed to get used to. I mean, you probably noticed it as a speed figure maker that it just seems like a consistent theme that the fillies in these top level races are just slower than the males with a bigger gap than I remember in the past.
Yeah, and it's bizarre because there was actually a time when the 2-year-olds, there was several years where they were always faster than the Colts. So maybe it's just a cyclical thing, something that just kind of random. But when the Phillies were faster, it wasn't by these kind of margins. I mean, maybe it's possible it's a training thing. I really don't know. And it's just something to keep an eye on. But it's stark differences between the two for feels like the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the winner. Just FYI, she's going to have to get faster if a really, a really good 2-year-old into 3-year-old filly does emerge running the kind of speed figures that we typically expect from a divisional leader. But I don't think we've yet seen the best of her. She feels like one that's going to keep getting better with distance. So I'm a fan of this likely 2-year-old filly champion. Move on to some of the turf racing on this Friday card. The Juvenile Fillies turf, won by another daughter of Justify in Hard to Justify. She got a good trip despite breaking from an outside post position, and I think trips really told the story here, Craig, because you had to save some ground on the Santa Anita turf course, and I think her main rival in the race, She Feels Pretty, was just unable to do so.
Yeah, trips made the difference. If anybody wants to tell me She Feels Pretty ran the best race, I wouldn't argue with them at all. I'd probably agree with them. I think feels pretty ran great. Not knocking John Velasquez. It was just when you draw the 11 hole, didn't have the same kind of early speed that Hard to Justify had. It's hard to not lose ground, and that's what happened. And hats off to Flavian Prad, who was able to get Hard to Justify out of the gate, get over to the rail, and run a good strong race. It wasn't the fastest race. It's one that we gave a pace upgrade to. Um, Not with the P notation, but it's just one where they finished so fast compared to the early pace, which was pretty slow. The pace fractions were only with the pace figures at the half mile was only in the 80s, which partly explains why Hard to Justify was able to get over so easily from the 12 hole. But from there, she was able to take advantage and hold off the foreign shipper for Donata O'Brien, Porta Fortuna, and She Feels Pretty. But again, I think this is a race. If you draw different posts and run this race 10 times, you might get four different winners.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny looking at the two turf races at a mile on Friday. You kind of would have expected the pace to be slower in the one for the males, but this is the one where the pace just didn't develop. And I mean, Flavian Pratt gave that perfect ride on Hard to Justify, hustling her to get forward, which allowed her to get over. And it really made the difference just in the first eighth of a mile of this race. That's what won Hard to Justify this race. But don't take anything away from the filly. She's really game. We saw it in her debut. We saw it in the Miss Grillo, the way she just continues to battle on to try to get her neck in front at the wire. So a good effort from the winner, but I wouldn't argue, like you said, with anybody who feels that She Feels Pretty is probably the best among this group. And I would imagine Cherie DeVoe even feels that way. I mean, this based on the year that she's had, it would have been fitting for her to have a Breeders' Cup victory with a horse like this, but it just wasn't meant to be. Still a horse that I think you can look forward to for next year. As for the male division and the juvenile turf, just further European domination, especially from Aidan O'Brien, and yet another fantastic ride from Ryan Moore on Unquestionable, who just did everything right, saved all the ground, was able to get into the clear at the top of the stretch, and run on by for the victory. I mean, when I watched this race, though, I'm not even sure Unquestionable was the best Aidan O'Brien horse in this race, because that was a huge run from the runner-up Mountain Bear, who had a much tougher trip.
Yeah, way tougher. Lost a lot of ground, had some traffic in between. Unquestionable got a 107 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort. Mountain Bear a 104, but I wouldn't argue with anyone that said that Mountain Bear was just as good. It was just a length and a half apart, and Aidan O'Brien's best horse might not even been in the races. He was scratched. He has others, but I mean ones that were actually entered in the race. Uh, River Tiber was one who he was unhappy that was scratched by the stewards. But it worked out in the end as he completed the exacta. And I thought My Boy Prince, I know a horse you liked. He ran fine. He was the best of the North American contingent. Just wasn't quite good enough to hold off the Europeans.
Yeah, I mean that is quite the ironic situation where Aidan O'Brien has River Tiber scratched out of caution from the veterinary team, and then he has another horse come out of the race with an injury. Mountain Bear coming out of the race with a non-displaced fracture. The prognosis, it seems like, is good compared to other injuries that we've seen leading up to Breeders' Cup week and on the day. But still, just I think it's a tough situation. It shows the tough spot that the veterinary team is in. And I think a lot of racing fans were frustrated by the scratches this past week. But I mean, I think we saw on the day that these injuries, even at the highest level, are very possible. And, you know, you want to be cautious. You want to try to remove horses that you have any suspicion about, but it's not a perfect system. There's a lot of subjectivity to it, especially with these foreign-based runners. I know a lot of the connections feel like the veterinary team doesn't know these horses. How can they make these calls about who's lame, who doesn't typically move this way? There was a lot of discussion about it this past week. Hopefully, the system and the way that these calls are made is refined in the future. But I'm not gonna knock the end goal here to be cautious, but it's just I think we saw how difficult it can be and how fallible human judgment can be, and when you can't always detect what's going wrong with a horse.
No, and I'm glad you brought it up. Like I said, I'm far from a horseman, not a vet. We got to do better than what we did this year, having this constant parade of scratches. It seems like, to me, you have to be able to trust a guy like Aiden O'Brien. If he says the horse is good, the horse should be good. I don't know where you draw the line on that, though. It's got to be one of the tougher jobs, but scratches were definitely one of the headlines. There were more than we've ever seen. I think I saw handle was way down. I would bet without the multitude of scratches that we had, handle probably wouldn't have been down. It had to have had a big effect. So hopefully the system gets better. Maybe these horses can be vetted sooner. Maybe even before the draw. I guess that maybe that's impossible. I don't know, but it was not a great situation.
Yeah, it's really tough, and I'm gonna play devil's advocate a little bit to that feeling. And I know I heard a lot of people voice what you were just saying, Craig. A lot of horse players that just frustrated that horses that they came up with liking in their handicapping get scratched. And I mean, when you're scratching horses from barns like Aiden O'Brien and Jessica Harrington, you're like thinking, what are we doing? These people aren't going to send unsound horses over. But I mean, at the same time, when you're looking at it from the other side, the Breeders' Cup is a day where there's so much planning that goes into running a horse, from not just bringing the horse over, but coordinating all the connections to be there. And I mean, there's a lot of pressure around that horse actually showing up and running in the race. A lot more calculus that goes into the horse being in the starting gate than just, oh, is this horse doing great right now? I mean, it's pointing there for months and months and weeks and a lot of investment. And I mean, if you're just leaving it up to the connections, is it all just about whether or not the horse is sound or whether or not the horse is doing great on the day? I bet there are other factors at play. I mean, just going back to the Kentucky Derby this year, I mean, we saw it with Forte. I mean, would Todd Pletcher be itching to run Forte in the Kentucky Derby with a foot bruise on a normal, Wednesday maiden race? I think that could be up for debate, or if you just really want to take a chance running the horse because it's the Kentucky Derby. So I get why we have to put in these checks and be cautious, especially given this pattern that we've had this year of horses breaking down on the biggest racing days. And once again, a huge racing day, one of the biggest of the year, and we did have a couple of injuries on Friday. I won't call them catastrophic yet because neither horse has been. I think both horses have undergone surgery, but still, when it keeps happening, I think you have to address it. So the system, it's probably not perfect at this point. Hopefully, it gets refined in the future. But I understand the intent of the endeavor.
Yeah, I do for sure. I think we have to. It's something that's going to get better over time. We don't want to get to the point where Europeans don't want to bring their horses, and I actually heard some of that. Because without them, this Breeders' Cup, frankly, wouldn't be much of the event that it is today. So maybe we get some input from them and kind of, surely something could be done ahead of time where even before these horses are shipped over, they could be checked out. And obviously, stuff can go wrong, but hopefully things will get better because it just can't have this parade of scratches every day after the post position draw. It's just a terrible look. Almost as bad, not obviously never as bad as a horse getting injured, but it just doesn't look good.
Yeah, I mean, if you're, I mean, we don't have to keep going on about this. I mean, I guess you'll never know if these scratches saved a horse's life. You don't know. I mean, I will say, Craig, as a handicapper, when just on a normal card in New York, how often do you see the little V for avoided claim and then see that it was a vet scratch or something, or avoided by the vet and then a subsequent layoff in a horse's running line? I mean, it's not typically the vets are seeing something, whether it's something that shows up day in and day out or prevents the horse from showing its best on that day. I mean, typically there's something there. I think the question is what's there a big enough risk that the horse has to be withdrawn on the day, and that's highly subjective. And I think you need further diagnostics to really make those calls to feel confident in those calls. I'm not gonna knock the level of precaution. I just think hopefully we can use some better diagnostic tools in the future. The Europeans, Craig, I mean, you brought up we'd missed their presence. I mean, they were so good this year, they even won the British Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint, which is a race that they've struggled in the past. And not only did they win it, they had the top three across the wire in the race this year, including the winner, Big Evs, who no doubt ran the best race.
Yeah, he did. He showed that speed that we were expecting when we saw his replays. He was able to do it again this year. Ran a very nice 109 TimeformUS speed figure, and not only did they win the race, I mean they swept the race, taking the top three positions. So big effort from him for sure. Not sure if we'll see him again, but he's a good one. And actually, this is I think 2 years in a row. They took the top two spots last year, so. They are taking this race much more seriously than they had the first few years of its existence.
And I only sort of realized it when I was watching this race again, and I would stand by what I first said that Big Evs was the best horse in the race, but that was some run from the runner-up Valiant Force, who, I mean, through no fault of William Buick, because I don't know what else he was supposed to do, but I mean, this horse got some crazy trip. I mean, he was legitimately four wide all the way around the far turn in a 5 furlong turf sprint at Santa Anita, and he lost the race by half a length. I mean, he put in some run to get up for second, despite losing all that ground. That was a big effort from that horse.
Yeah, it's one where you kind of got to weigh the trip versus the pace. This was a race that
Yes.
just had a blazing fast pace, and when you look at the chart, it definitely kind of fell apart. Crimson Advocate, the horse who went over to win at Royal Ascot, set the pace and was beaten back into sixth. Obviously, the field's pretty grouped together in a 5 furlong race. They're not just going to totally pack it in, but it did seem like it was a race where the flow kind of favored the closers. I did want to address, I saw an interesting tweet, and unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the guy who said it. I know it's a knowledgeable Twitter person asking about the difference in speed figures between this and the turf sprint because. How much could the track really change in perfect conditions? And this race was basically the same final time, a little bit slower than the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. My only answer is, this was the rails had not been down in a very long time. This was the first time this part of the course had been used in quite some time. And all I can guess is that the course was just in pristine condition. By the time the turf sprint rolled around on Saturday, there had been many races run over this turf course. So that's the only explanation I can come up with. We use projections for these speed figures, not always easy to do with 2-year-olds, but I think it would be extremely unlikely that they ran as fast as their older counterparts.
And beyond that, Craig, it's turf racing. And as a speed figure maker, I know that you're aware that you'd probably be the first to say that you can't always compare one final time to the next, even when the track is consistent or even on the same day in turf racing due to differences in pace and difference in class. You just see some races that are just really hard to compare at times, and sometimes it just comes down to the fractions. And this race started out at an absolutely blazing clip, and it's the kind of race where maybe you could have even given it a faster final time fig, but you put in the P designation to adjust it down a little bit because a number in the 120s just wouldn't make any sense for these 2-year-olds.
Yeah, exactly. And we do have the fractions coded in red. The other difference I noticed was the run up for this one was probably 7 to 8, maybe even 10 feet longer than for the sprint. Not a huge difference, particularly when the run ups, I assume it was around the 80 feet that it's listed, but enough to make somewhat of a difference. And yeah, that 20.71 opening quarter is certainly going to affect the final time. They almost have to run a fast final time when they go that fast early.
Well, Craig, that wraps up our recap of this past week's Breeders' Cup. It was a really fun one. I mean, we saw, as we said at the top, a lot of really great performances. I mean, something I didn't really comment on when we were going through it was a takeaway was just what a huge couple of days trainer Bill Mott had. I mean, with the three winners, Just FYI, Cody's Wish, and Elite Power, possibly three champions among them. Maybe I'm going out on a little bit of a limb here, although I've been kind of beating this drum for a little while, that Bill Mott feels like this is a year where he's supposed to garner some real consideration for a Trainer Eclipse Award. I know that voters get that list of stats and they see that Chad Brown and Brad Cox are at the top of the earnings list because they just run more horses, they have more stakes horses, and those earnings just pile up and the voters just kind of go with that. But I mean, I think that you have to kind of look and see, I mean, which trainers really outperformed the stock that they have. And I mean, he's just a guy that really did great with the good horses that he's got in his barn. So hopefully that's a more competitive award than it usually is.
Yeah, he has my vote. I mean, I think he is going to wind up with three champions. As I said, I think Cody's Wish will probably win Horse of the Year, which means he'll probably also win Older Horse of the Year. And I think the other two are pretty much slam dunks. So hard for me to see a guy who's winning all those Eclipse Awards not win it as a trainer, particularly when you look at the number of horses he has compared to his competition. So for me, that one's a no-brainer when it comes to the vote. He's going to get mine.
I don't know if anything else you have to discuss from this past weekend, Craig, but a lot going on. It always feels like after the Breeders' Cup is over, I just need to like take a day to take a deep breath to recharge because you put so much work into the Breeders' Cup. I mean, there's so much energy that goes into watching the races on those Friday and Saturday, betting on them, staying on top of it all, winning, losing. The Breeders' Cup can be very mentally exhausting, but now that we're through it, I feel like we've had some time to process and sure, there are some horses retiring, but there's still things to look forward to for next year and the rest of this season.
Yeah, it is an exhausting time. I can tell you, I stayed up late last night and knocked out the figures for Monday just so I could have a couple days to finally decompress. And then, it's horse racing. It never stops. I think we get one, sometimes 2 days off a year, and that's it. There's horse racing every other day of the year. So we'll be right back at it. I'm sure plenty of these horses will come back. So yeah, plenty races to talk about. And I always look forward to Thanksgiving weekend. It's one of my favorites, and that'll be here before we know it.
Well, Craig, you and I will be back at it later this week doing our typical handicapping on the TimeformUS forecast. Still waiting to see which racetrack we're going to handicap this weekend. Fingers crossed. Hopefully there's actually no wet weather in New York this week. We'll see how that comes up because I think they're running a couple turf stakes this weekend. But we'll take a look at a pick five sequence and get back to our usual schedule in the second half of this week. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in. Make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up in the second half of this week.